People come trickling in. Thank you for attending, and thank you for attending on time. Our guest this evening is Aghogho Edevbie. That's as close as I can get, Aghogho. I hope I got it right. The Michigan Director of All Voting is Local. And tonight, we're going to talk about the campaign to sabotage our elections and what we can do about it. I had hoped that we could have a summer of lighter topics. We had last week at Serval, talked about his books, and Mr. B, Mark Braun, talked about his tricycle with a piano on the back. And then next week, we're going to be celebrating diversity with Nancy Margolis. And following that, Eli Nyberger, the new executive director of the Ann Arbor District Library, will be my guest. But a topic kept coming up that I was seeing, which is the campaign to sabotage our elections. And I started seeing more and more about it. And I said, well, we can't take the summer off. We need to start working to combat what I think is some very serious issues. And that's what we're going to do tonight. I want to thank my partner here, Noemi Herzig, who's handling the logistics and the technical aspects of the show, and all of you for attending, and the JCC for sponsoring us, and Bernie Bannett, who helped me research for tonight's show. So a Detroit native, Aghogho has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Michigan and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Michigan Law School. And in my conversations with him, I can tell you he is a proud Wolverine. Aghogho, I understand that you spent time teaching in Tanzania.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and maybe some of the things that happened to you there?
Yeah, so I went to UD Jesuit High School and was kind of challenged by one of my teachers to spend some time in the developing world. And so after law school, I had some time before I started at Baltimore and decided to take him up on that offer. And he suggested that I go to a school called St. Peter Claver in Dodoma, Tanzania, which is the capital, but is kind of remote from the major airport. You have to take a 8-hour bus ride with one rest stop along the way. And it was great because I taught these kids who were basically the equivalent of our freshmen in high school about civics. And they taught me a lot about how they see life and some of the challenges that they face in their communities. And ultimately it was a really great experience being with them for a little bit of time and, learning about each other.
Do you think your advisor was right that you would did you benefit from the experience? What did you take away from it?
Yeah, I think that I took away from it that, we are incredibly blessed in the United States of America to have so much and that others aren't as fortunate. But I also think that we all throughout the world have similar hopes and dreams and that we're all connected. And I think it's important to remember that when, there are things going on across the world and challenges going across the world, that we're not too different. I think sometimes it's really easy to think that we're super different from people in other countries. So I think that was probably the biggest thing I took away from it.
Did you enjoy the cuisine?
Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. I had a very interesting moment where so every week we would get together, all the volunteers. Some of them were also from America, some of them were from Europe, and we'd get together with the Jesuit priests. And I was in a food line and I saw a piece of meat. I didn't really know what it was, but I was just, trying to keep the line moving. And I served it and I realized it was a goat tongue. It was not the most appetizing, but I did eat it because, when in Rome. Yeah, most of the time food was good. Some that day, not as great.
You are a very proper host. I
Yeah.
mean, yes. Far from an ugly American. So, yeah, tell us about all voting is local. What's its mission?
So our mission is, generally to dismantle barriers to people voting. So we focus exclusively on election administration issues. So that can range from, doing a lot of advocacy work with clerks to ensure that they're sending out absentee ballots on time. It can also range to putting out standards that we're asking local election officials to uphold, or to, working with the media to educate them on, what the law is and what the law isn't. There are there are people in the media who don't always understand, what the law is, and we're very committed to making sure that the truth gets out there.
And what's your job as the Michigan director?
So I kind of oversee our effort. There are 3 other people who work with me. Vince is our communications manager. Ben is our, campaign lead. And then Kelsey is our grassroots manager. And so I kind of help direct those efforts. And sometimes, our Ben takes a really big lead on working with the different advocacy groups that we work with. Kelsey does a lot of logistical work, but also working with different groups who are talking to clerks across the state. And of course, Vince works on our communications plans.
And do you also seek and utilize volunteers?
Yeah, sometimes we do. We mostly work with other organizations who do that. So Voters Not Politicians is a group that we work with a lot. Promote the Vote also has, a pretty significant volunteer capacity. And, one of the things that I know we have a really civically engaged group here. If you'd like to be a poll challenger this coming November, we could absolutely use you. Just send your email or email me, and I'll share my email in the chat. And I can make sure that you're signed up to be a poll challenger this November.
We'll talk some more about that later, and I'll give you a chance to enter in the chat whatever you wish in a moment, because there's something I'd like to discuss. You work with the media, you work with the clerks, work with any other officials?
Secretary of State's office. We always, are very good communication with them. Sometimes mayors. We frequently talk to Mayor Duggan's office. Mayor Duggan's office was pretty instrumental in 2020 in making sure we had enough poll workers to administer the election, because there was a huge issue in August and not having enough in August 2020. And I would say Mayor Duggan really stepped up to the plate there. So it just ranges based on need and the issues that we see.
What attracted you to this work?
Well,
You've got your law degree, you got a lot of options. Why this?
It's true. Well, I kind of started on this path without really intending on it in law school. I have always, while this is a C3 space and I'm a C3 nonprofit director, I am a Democrat, and I've always been a good volunteer with the party. And when I was in law school, Amanda Stitt, who some of you may know, called me and said, we need some people on our voter protection team. And so I started volunteering, and that was back in 2010. And I did that for a while. Then they promoted me to work in the boiler room. And then I eventually was a voter protection director for a congressional campaign. And then this job came up in late 2019, and I just stumbled upon it. And it matched a lot of the things that I was passionate about: voting rights. My parents are immigrants from Nigeria, where there isn't a strong tradition of democracy. And it's always been imparted upon me about how important it is to vote. And obviously my love of politics came within it. And then using my legal background to, help people. So this is kind of a perfect job blending in a lot of different interests. And it is really exciting that, I never really intended to be a director of a voting rights organization when I started in law school, but here I am.
What did you intend to be when you started law school?
Well, I thought that I would work for a firm for a bit and then, maybe do something else. But I really went primarily because I wanted to deepen my critical thinking skills, which I did.
Okay. So I started researching for the show with Bernie Bannett's valuable help, and I discovered there was a lot more to this campaign to sabotage the election than I ever realized. And I'm going to cite some of the things that I learned. Politico reported obtaining tapes where the Republican National Election Integrity Director, Josh Finley, repeatedly characterizes the committee's role as supporting in-state coalitions, delivering staff, organization, and muscle in key states to the person they identify as the quarterback of the effort to create a permanent workforce, conservative elections attorney Cleta Mitchell, who was a central figure in former President Donald Trump's legal strategy to overturn the 2020 election. Quote, "It's a place the left sees as a great target of opportunity. You have to make sure that doesn't happen," she said, referring to Democratic efforts to register voters from traditionally underrepresented voting blocks. Recordings also feature Mitchell speaking openly about the need to challenge efforts by nonprofit groups, I bet a number of them are represented on this call, aligned with Democrats to create a new American majority of young voters, people of color, and unmarried women. In the tapes, Mitchell also disparaged the Democrats' recent warnings about threats to democracy. Quote, "They bring democracy to the doorstep. I want to pause right here. We don't live in a democracy," Mitchell said to a round of applause from the crowd. But to the left, everything is about democracy. The democracy fund, the democracy this, the democracy that. "We live in a constitutional republic," she said. Closer to home, Matthew Seyfried, the Republican National Committee Michigan Election Integrity Director, said, "We're going to recruit, and truly, it's going to be an army, right? We're going to try and recruit lawyers. We're going to have more lawyers than have ever been recruited. Because let's be honest, that's where it's going to be fought, right? We're going to have lawyers that work early to build relationships with different judges. So when that happens, we're going to have lawyers that have relationships with the police chiefs in different areas. So when that happens, with pre-existing relationships already established, so they can't lie. Do we need our lawyers?"
Well, I always think lawyers are a good one to have in your phone dial, just in case. But there are some concerns, and we took some action on it. I think it's very funny that she mentioned that we live in a constitutional republic. I think anytime someone says we live in a republic, ask them for a definition of what a republic is, because a republic is a representative democracy. And this is based on us voting and determining the direction of this country through our ballots. But this is a threat, and we worked with the Brennan Center in New York, and I'm going to share another link in the chat, to develop a list of standards or rules and constraints of what election inspectors, poll workers can and cannot do. And we developed these standards over the course of about a month, doing a lot of intense legal research and sending drafts back and forth. And we trained over 25 different organizations across the state to talk to clerks all across the state to make sure they knew what the rules were. And we also asked the Secretary of State to take some action to make clear that if someone is an election inspector, that they can be dismissed from their role if they're interfering. I'm very happy to report that the Secretary of State's office, the Bureau of Elections, issued a very helpful guide to just clearly outline that election inspectors are not some independent entity that can kind of develop their own rules and procedures on the fly, but they report to the clerk. They must follow Michigan election law, And if they are interfering with the administration of elections, they can be dismissed. And so that cleared up a lot of things and gave clerks who were asking us behind the scenes. I remember I had a very lengthy conversation with the clerk's office team and a municipality which will not be named. But they said, we'd love to do this, but we'd love some authority from the Secretary of State's office. And they have that authority now. And I think, overall things went well in August, and we're hopeful to keep that going for November.
I'm trying to remember. Are there as many as 1,600 clerks in Michigan? It could be.
I think it's around 1,500, but
yeah, something like that. That's
something like
that.
that.
Clerks. It can't be easy to get to all of them. How does a clerk become a clerk? What's the process? Obviously, they have great authority here.
Yeah, well, it depends. Typically township clerks are appointed, and city clerks are elected, and county clerks are also elected. But in some municipalities, based on their charters, they can also be appointed as well. So it just really depends on the community that you're in.
Do you see any efforts to get clerks that are not inclined to want to enforce the laws and regulations? Is that going on anywhere?
No, I think all clerks want a smooth operation, and I think a lot of them are very tired of the conspiracy theories that have resulted from the 2020 election. We had a really great conversation. I would say great in that we learned a lot of information, but it was very unfortunate with the county clerk in Saginaw. And she told us a lot about how some of the local clerks in the county were quitting and resigning because of the harassment they've received from a lot of people in the community about some of these conspiracy theories around the 2020 general election. So I think every clerk that we've talked to wants order and wants to get past this very divisive stage that we're in and ensure that everyone has the right to vote. I think sometimes when there are disagreements between all voting is local and clerks, it really stems down to how much can you use your powers to really ensure that everyone is aware that there's an election, that everyone can vote even if they don't know all the rules. It's very important to use the laws that we have on the books to the furthest extent to make sure that everyone has a voice in our process.
The laws are only as good as the willingness and ability of people to enforce them. We've seen that before in our history in this country. I was reading very recently that 20% of all the clerks, well, I think it was election workers, are either considering or are going to quit because of this harassment. And that's another threat. And what can be done to make sure that people of integrity replace them?
Well, I think that we need, I hope everyone who, if you have the ability to, please volunteer to be an election inspector. There is, always a need in some part of the state for election inspectors. And I just put in the link michigan.gov/democracy-MVP, where you can sign up through the Secretary of State's website to sign up to be an election inspector. That's the legal term for poll worker in the state of Michigan. So that's one thing that people can do. If you hear of anything that is untoward about towards clerks or their staffs, report it. And you can contact 866-R-VOTE, and that is the nonpartisan voter election hotline. And I think, also the other thing that everyone can do is when you hear someone spreading conspiracy theories, push back against it. I think it's very easy that we don't want to get involved in conversations. We don't want to have, be in conflict with our friends and our family. But when we allow things to fester, they grow. It's really on us to police and to talk to our friends and family and to make sure that, the conspiracy theories that are quite frankly unhelpful and not rooted in reality don't spread.
You're being very restrained, but I understand you're a representative of a C3, so, which I am not. I've read that the election subversion plans to not count votes cast by having them set aside at the polls and creating massive doubt about the election so it can swing to the legislature. Does that make sense to you? I know we're still early in this and we're not sure how much malicious mischief, calling it mischief seems a little mild, we're going to see in this upcoming election in November, but some feel it's a dress rehearsal for 2024. Do you think there's a concerted effort out there to cause chaos at the polls?
Well, I definitely think there are people who would be happy if there was chaos at the polls. And whether it's a concerted effort, I will reserve comment. Because I don't have any proof of that, and I don't want to accuse any one entity, but I do think there are people who would be very happy with that, and there are some people out there who are attempting to cause that chaos. But I am very confident, and I tell this to reporters all the time, that our laws are working. We have, people in the state who are being prosecuted and are being investigated for their attempts to undermine our system. And, ultimately, while 2020 was ugly, and that cannot be emphasized anymore, it was very ugly and very unfortunate. Ultimately, the system worked. The votes were counted, the votes were respected, they were certified, and we had a new president as a result. So I want people to have that confidence that the system is working.
Yeah, I don't mean to be a naysayer. What I do mean to do, though, is to tell people the jeopardy we're in if they don't get involved, because a lot of the people who certified that election have been replaced by people who did not think that election was fair. And just because last time we got through this doesn't mean that if we just sit on our hands, we're going to get through it this time. Moving right along.
Well, if I could just add one point there. I totally agree with you. And I think everyone needs to vote, and they should be voting for people who are going to respect the rule of law. I do think, fortunately in our state, we have a great system. I would say a good system. I think that's a better way to say it, of how we certify our elections. So there's a county board of canvassers in each of the 83 counties. And they have 14 days from election day to certify the results. And you need at least 3 votes. There are 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans on these boards. If they don't certify, the State Board of Canvassers has 10 days from the time they receive all their materials from the county to certify that vote. And while there are definitely some issues in some of the counties, I have a lot of confidence in the State Board of Canvassers to ultimately certify any election result this November and in 2024.
I suspect that most of us were not familiar with the process, so that is comforting indeed. So again, moving right along, an influential network of conservative activists fixated on the idea that former President Donald Trump won the 2020 election is working to recruit county sheriffs to investigate elections based on the false notion that voter fraud is widespread. And this following quote illustrates a point that you made previously, Aghogho. I'm absolutely sick of it, said Pam Palmer, the clerk of Berry County, Michigan, where the sheriff has carried out an investigation into the 2020 results for more than a year. We didn't do anything wrong, but they've cast a cloud over our entire county that makes people disbelieve in the accuracy of our ability to run an election. I've heard there's a plan that instead of, and we'll talk about, if someone working at the poll has a concern about a ballot that's being cast, what are they supposed to do at that point?
Well, if under Michigan law, a election inspector or poll worker does have the ability to challenge someone's ballot. And what is supposed to happen is if you have the concern that someone is not eligible to cast their vote, they must take an oath pledging, stating that they are, eligible to vote. They sign something and then they're given a ballot. There's no ability for a challenger or a election inspector on his or her own to deny someone a ballot ever. Unless, that person, that voter refuses to take the oath, affirming their ability and their eligibility to vote.
So what I was reading is that there is a plan to instruct poll workers to call the sheriff instead. What would happen under those circumstances?
Yeah, so we released a statement actually this past week, detailing that it is irresponsible for anyone to call 911 or a sheriff instead of going to their clerk. The chain of command is to go to the clerk with any issues. If there is an issue there, then you go to the Secretary of State's office. You don't go to the sheriff's office. But there is this notion, and you mentioned Berry County. The Berry County Sheriff, Dar Leaf, has this notion that he is a constitutional sheriff. And I won't go into all the details, but he essentially believes that his powers are supreme to any other elected official in the state of Michigan, in the country, including the president of the United States. That is how loony, this guy's beliefs are. But unfortunately for him, there's no real basis in law for that belief, of course. And he is running into a lot of different obstacles and barriers to that. And he's being investigated by the Attorney General.
Speaking of the Attorney General and other state officials, there's a group called the American First Secretary of State Coalition, who was formed by radical MAGA candidates who are running for Secretary of States in key battleground states. And their goal is to elect Trump marionettes to the top elections administrations in critical swing states so that when the 2024 election comes, they will have the power to declare Trump the winner, no matter the true will of the voters. I know you can't endorse candidates, but do you think Michigan's elected officials, particularly at the state level and at the clerk, well, you've already sort of addressed this, but I'm going to ask it again anyway, and the clerks have done a good job and are going to continue to do a good job in protecting our elections?
Yeah, I think for the most part, and I do think it's scary. I won't identify who these candidates are by name or by party,
Right.
but there was in another state. I saw a video of someone who won a primary who said, "Great, that's 20 votes for Trump," meaning 20 electoral votes for Trump.
Was it a primary for Secretary of State, or?
No, this was for a governor, because under federal law, a governor, is kind of, one of the final arbiters of who wins the electoral votes of their states. So the governors have a pretty critical role in determining electors that are sent to the Congress. So that was scary. And, we also have some folks who are running in Michigan who simply don't understand the rules. I think one of the things that is always frustrating to me is you hear people complain about the election process, make up stuff about the election process, and it's very clear that they've never read any of the manuals that are available online at the Secretary of State's website. They don't understand election law. And some of them just, quite frankly, are angry at the rules that we have on the books, to which I say to them, call up your state senator, call up your state representative, have them introduce a bill. We will obviously advocate against those bills, but that's the process of changing the law. It's not intimidating and screaming at election workers who are simply trying to do their job.
You mentioned the Brennan Center earlier, and they did an analysis of the Conservative Partnership Institute that's working to plant election deniers at all levels in our electoral machinery. Quote, we are arming the army of patriots. That is our goal. And it was said by our friend that we heard from earlier, Cleta Mitchell, and talking to Steve Bannon on his podcast. And the partnership provides an army with a handbook that makes phony claims of nonpartisanship while also urging followers to label staffers in state attorney general's offices as friend or foe. It equips readers with just enough information to be dangerous, but not nearly enough to be helpful. For example, it encourages people to try and identify bad addresses on voter rolls, but it doesn't instruct them on how to differentiate an incorrect address from a student away at college. As a result, professional election officials, the people who actually know what they're doing, will be inundated with baseless challenges to voter registration. Their goal is to create chaos. All seems to be of a part. So I think you covered what can be done to deal with these cases. There are some other things we can do generally. Isn't it a good idea, to, at least from the point of view of having fewer things to deal with, if people vote by absentee ballot as opposed to in person?
I think anyone should vote the way they're most comfortable voting. Absentee ballots are obviously very convenient, and it reduces the number of people at a polling location. But what we're seeing and the work that we're doing is that there's an increased focus by conspiracy theorists to focus on the absentee ballot process. Now that cuts both ways. The wonderful thing about the absentee ballot process is the convenience for people. And additionally, I would say with the Detroit Counting Board is you have the highest ranking officials in the Detroit clerk's office. It's a secure site, everyone right there. So any challenges and anything that's done can be, dealt with in a very quick manner. Whereas at a polling location and, the far rungs of a city or anywhere, you're susceptible to challenges that, you may not be able to be responded to as quickly. But each method, whether you're voting at a polling place on election day, whether you're voting at your clerk's office, absentee, or voting by mail, is secure. And I encourage everyone, just do what you feel best.
I can appreciate that and certainly endorse it. But one of the ways that one can make it more difficult to vote is to have long lines at the polling place. And one way to have long lines at the polling place is to induce chaos in the process, which you can't do with an absentee ballot vote. So, and of course, another advantage of the absentee ballot is that election results will come in much sooner. And of course, what we saw in 2020 was, wait a minute, Trump was leading, and then 3 days later, he's not leading. That's mischief must be going on. So the sooner that their final results are announced, the better. But that's just my commercial. And of course, we don't want a close election. If it comes down to a few hanging chads, there's going to be a lot more dispute than if it's really a clear outcome in terms of the election. We spoke, we just spoke about Wayne County. So, and this may be my last long quote. Monica Palmer was a member of the Wayne County Board of Canvassers. She was appointed by party leaders to certify election results. This is she was the Republican representative. To replace her, the Republicans nominated 3 candidates who all have said they don't trust the results of the 2020 election. The weeks after the election, she'd received, this is the one woman who certified, death threats and text messages with photos of dead naked women. Some of the threats mentioned her daughter. She even found herself on the phone with Trump after the certification, and his campaign was still fighting in courts to overturn Michigan's results. Republican leaders in Michigan have purged GOP canvassers in 8 of the largest counties: Macomb, Washtenaw, Ingham, Kalamazoo, Livingston, Saginaw, and Genesee, according to the Detroit News last year. At least half of them were replaced with people who have publicly cast doubts on the 2020 election results. So we talked about that. We know that the security measures are being tightened at the city's, at Detroit Central Counting Board. At least they were during the primary elections. And that the Justice Department's election task force is prosecuting people who have threatened election officials. To date, task force investigated more than 1,000 complaints and has prosecuted 5 people. So we are, as I said, as you've said, and as I agree, we're very lucky in the state that we have clear regulations, all sorts of laws and regulations to protect ourselves. We've got a state government, state administration that is enforcing it intelligently. And as you point out, the clerks themselves want to do their part. So what are the roles that, if someone wants to be an election day worker, what are the various roles that they can assume?
Yes. So if you wanted to volunteer on election day, you can be an election worker, a poll worker with your municipality, whether that's Ann Arbor or any other municipality throughout the state of Michigan. You can go to Democracy.
So you don't have to live in the jurisdiction where you're a poll worker,
No,
correct?
no. It's based, and there are a lot of communities that need poll workers, and there is a law in the books in Michigan that you're supposed to have at least one member of each party as a poll worker at each precinct. And some communities, it's harder to reach that balance. So if you have the ability to go to a more conservative area, if you're a Democrat, or if you're a Republican, go to a more liberal area, I really encourage you to do that, because it's one of those things that no community, there was a real push in this primary to try and meet that letter of the law. But most communities, that have the real disparity in terms of partisanship, in terms of their citizenry, weren't able to do it just because of the disparity of where we live. Now we live in increased enclaves of, if you live in Detroit, you live around all Democrats. If you live in Ann Arbor, you live around all Democrats. But if you live in a rural area of Michigan, you're probably living around all Republicans. And that's a real vulnerability, because there are some of the conspiracy theorists keep pushing on this notion that there's not real transparency. So signing up to be an election, a poll worker is a key thing. Signing up to be a poll challenger with a nonpartisan organization like ours, or with your party. Each party has the ability to have poll workers either at the absentee ballot counting boards or at polling locations. And of course, you can be a poll monitor, and both of those organizations also do that as well. So those are kind of the key things: poll worker, poll challenger, poll monitor.
Where could one find out where they're most needed?
Well, it really, I think all three, there really isn't, I would say, I hesitate to say most needed. Personally, I think the most needed is poll worker, because we need that balance, and that is a really, that's a huge vulnerability.
And
Uh,
what's the responsibility of a poll worker?
a poll worker is simply, at your precinct, they administer the election, they issue ballots to voters, oversee the process at your precinct. If they're a poll worker at the absentee counting board, they're counting the ballots physically. So a poll worker is, under the legal term is election inspector. I know I've been using them interchangeably, but poll worker equals election inspector. A poll challenger, I am seeing this question in the chat, is someone who is affiliated with a nonprofit or one of the major political parties, or the minor political parties too, who's simply there to monitor the election and, if necessary, challenge the administration of it if they're conducting it in a poor fashion or not according to the law, or challenge the eligibility of a voter. That is the additional powers that a poll challenger has. And then a poll monitor is simply someone who is just there to observe the election.
They observe, and do they report back? Do they have the ability to report out?
Yes. So you cannot record video or take photographs in a polling location or an absentee ballot counting board, but you can certainly take notes and report it to your organization if you're a poll monitor or poll challenger.
And poll workers are paid or can be paid, is that correct?
All poll workers must be paid under
Must be
Michigan law. But
And
it's
the other
determined,
positions are not paid.
typically not.
Okay. How can someone determine which jurisdiction needs more election workers?
Well, it's not really, I think, unfortunately, there's not a centralized system where we can see how many poll workers are here or how many poll workers are there. But I think the best way for you to be utilized is to go to that Democracy MVP website I shared earlier and click as many boxes as possible, or be as widely available. And the Secretary of State's office will put you where you're most needed. And we certainly advocate, and we're always on the phone with the Secretary of State's office in the weeks leading up to Election Day to make sure that municipalities all over the state have the poll workers they need. So if your heart is really set on being a poll worker or an election inspector, you can go to Democracy MVP and they will place you where you're needed.
All right, those of us who play roles in communicating how people can help. I just heard Aghogho provide us a couple excellent sources for the data that we should be propagating. Thank you for that. How physically difficult? What are the qualifications? Maybe it's stamina or whatever for being an election worker. Aren't you required to stay till it's done? Some things.
So if you sign up to be a poll worker, an election inspector, you have to be there all day, and that is a very long day. If polls open, you typically have to get to your assignment by 6:30 a.m. And if you're working at a polling location, you're probably not going to leave until 9 p.m. at the earliest. And that's if all the steps are followed and everything adds up. So it's a long day.
And if it doesn't add up?
Then you have to figure out what's happening. And that can take some troubleshooting. Or you have to, some remarks in the poll book about why things aren't adding up. So it can take longer. But if you're a poll challenger, you can work with the organization that appoints you to determine hours, and you can, typically sign up and say, I only want to be there for 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever. And there's a lot more flexibility as to be a poll challenger or a poll monitor.
I saw a question flit by. What's the training process? They just throw you to the wolves, or?
Well, for a election inspector, a poll worker, you have to go through a training process, and that is outlined in state law that is a requirement. And typically you're trained by the city or township clerk that appoints you. Well, you're appointed by the election board of the city, but you're typically trained by the city clerk. As for poll challengers and poll monitors, there is no requirement currently on the books for you to be trained. I personally think it is extremely unwise not to be trained, and I'm going to put in the chat a link to the guide that the Secretary of State has issued for poll challengers.
Right.
So if you want to be a poll challenger, I advise people to read that very carefully, or work with an organization that is going to train you. If you work with All Voting is Local, and we work with Promote the Vote very closely on this, you will attend a training. But if you're not, one of the issues that I personally saw in 2020, working at TCF the day after the election, is that many of the poll challengers for certain organizations did not provide training to their poll challengers, and they were challenging things that were completely aligned with the law. And that slows down the process, and it leads to frustration on both sides.
I've never seen as many questions or comments in chat, and you're the 38th guest as tonight. So Noemi, can you start picking out some of the better ones for us?
Yes, so Jamie Lyons Eddie says, I'm from Voters Not Politicians, and can confirm that we love working with All Voting is Local. So that's a compliment.
We love working with All Voting is with Voters Not Politicians, and Jamie too.
So somebody is asking about training, and you just answered that, but I am concerned about county clerks not running for office again because they've been harassed, their lives have been threatened, etc. If they are driven from office, is it possible they could be replaced by MAGA Republicans who will falsify election results?
So let me address that in two parts. Is it possible that there are county clerks and local clerks who are increasingly becoming uncomfortable being clerks with the harassment, and they will leave office? Yes, and it is happening in some areas of our state. Is it possible that they'll be replaced by people who will have the ability to falsify election results? No. And the reason I say that is there are so many safeguards in the law, in the procedures, that are verified not only by the clerks themselves or the election inspectors at the polling locations or at the AV counting boards or at the certification stage, both at the county and state level, that no one can falsify results. So elections can't be rigged. And if there is a clerk that's not following the law, the Secretary of State has the ability under her supervisional powers to replace and remove a clerk from administering the election. And Secretary Benson has had to do that a couple of times in this last 2 years because of that issue. So I just want to reassure people, yeah, there are problems, and maybe you will get a clerk in some part of the state that is an election denier, but that person's not going to have the ability to manipulate the vote totals. But the concern that I have when that happens is that just the presence of that person being in the office dissuades people from voting. So we really all have to pull together to vote, ensure that people who are election deniers aren't taking office, and also continue pushing back in our own personal conversations and our own personal networks to not give life to these conspiracy theories.
And make sure we re-elect people who will enforce the law like we have now. Critical.
Yeah.
So
Other-
one person, Manjula Jindal, talks about, she says that might be off topic, but as an election inspector and precinct chair, I'm also concerned that voters are allowed to bring in firearms if they have a license to carry, even if the polling places are schools. And during some elections, those schools are in session with children in attendance. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
So I'm gonna try, here it is. I actually just was able to find the rules on that. And I just posted them in the chat. My understanding is that you cannot have concealed carry in schools and place of worship unless you have permission from the school or the place of worship. So that just can't happen, and you can report that. However, if your polling place is not a school or not a place of worship, or that person hasn't obtained permission from the school or place of worship, they are allowed to bring in their gun. Unfortunately, the laws that we have in the state constrain this and the ability to kick people out who are doing this. And it's something very concerning. I personally think that we should change these laws and get some tighter gun control legislation on the books.
Stay tuned. We might have something interesting in 2023. There are people talking about this.
Okay. I served as a poll challenger and an AVCB challenger in Detroit in July and August. Would it be more useful, in your opinion, as a poll inspector during the general election in November?
I think it really depends on what you're comfortable with. I think there's a big need for election inspectors in more red areas of the state, if I'm reading this route correctly. Just to make sure that we have that balance, but there's also a need for, Republicans in Detroit as election inspectors, because it's not just, we want people who are going to follow the rule of law and believe in the rule of law to be election inspectors. And if you know of Republicans or you're a Republican, I urge you to sign up to be an election inspector in Detroit, because we really need to help that team there have the balance in as many places as possible. That being said, if you're comfortable being a poll challenger, please do it. We also need that. We didn't have a lot this is August primary, and it's one of our top priorities to recruit more people for the November election. And we need to have that coverage there with the poll challengers, because they're our first eyes and ears on a situation potentially bubbling up, to report back to us and give us some good information that we can use to go and advocate with the clerk or to bring an issue to the Secretary of State's office's attention. And that happened just this past Tuesday.
I would imagine that if I were to volunteer to be an election worker in Manchester, they probably close their books or their results coming quicker than, say, Detroit, simply because it's a smaller community. Is that a fair assessment for someone who probably doesn't want to be there for 18 hours?
Yeah, I do think it's fair, and that reminds me of an earlier point. Election results now they may take longer because they cannot be directly uploaded to the internet anymore. The Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal commission, has provided advice to many clerks that they not do that. in light of some technological challenges. And so it's just taking longer to get election results out. And it was particularly the case in Wayne County this past Tuesday. So it really doesn't matter in terms of getting the results out on time. But for smaller communities, yeah, they have less ballots to count. So it's going to take them less time to get through the process. So yeah, I think that is a fair assessment.
Okay, fellow senior citizens, we have our guidance there. Other questions, comments?
This is all about the training. There are multiple shifts in Detroit, but once you arrive, you were sequestered from the time you arrived until the polls closed at 8 p.m. And you must take an oath to uphold the Constitution. You also get an election inspector certificate of training that is good for a period of 2 years. So these are just comments. Could you comment on the independent state legislator theory and the Supreme Court case that could validate it? This could enable legislatures to pass voter suppression laws and overturn elections. Could it not?
Yeah, I'm going to try and explain it very quickly without going into too much detail. Under the Constitution, I'll take one example of it. I think we're all interested in the presidential election here. Each state legislature has the ability to determine how their electors are determined. And so within that realm, state legislatures pass laws and kind of give away their power to the electorate, but they also give away their power to clerks and local officials to administer those elections. And within that process, those laws are reviewable by state court judges and by other officials in the state. The independent state legislature theory essentially says that a legislature has no ability to be reviewed by most state officials. The only person that can kind of check, or the only body that can check them, is Congress, and to a certain extent, federal judges. So it's a really radical transformation of Michigan election law around all the country, in that the legislatures would essentially be unaccountable to their people, except through elections every 2 years.
So the last question here, is there a possibility that Michigan could count absentee ballots before election day?
Not currently. In 2020, we had a small law, or a small window into something somewhat better, where there was pre-processing just for that election. There was actually a sunset written into the law that it only applied for the 2020 general election. I heard mixed opinions from clerks about how that process worked, but certainly I think that process could be improved, and I'm very hopeful that the legislature will pass a new law allowing that. But there hasn't been any movement on it in the legislature to date.
Is that it, Noemi?
I think that's it. I mean, yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Aghogho, from the enthusiastic participation of your viewers today. I think that they learned a lot, and appreciate your being here. I, for one, feel much more comforted by the fact that we have robust regulations and people such as yourself and in our state government that have the ability, with all of our help, to become election workers and be part of this process, that we are going to have a free and fair election. So thank you very much for being with us.
Very informative. Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
It was great to be with everyone. Really appreciative of all the great conversations that you guys have. I've watched a couple of them. They're very great. And thanks for all the good work that you do in Ann Arbor and the surrounding communities.
Terrific. And again, thank you, Noemi, and the JCC. 2 weeks from now, 21st, Nancy Margolis, who you can see in this. No, she doesn't want to talk to us yet, but she's going to talk to us in 2 weeks. And we're going to talk about, and I think she's muted anyway. So, and we're up, our time's up. Embracing our differences. It's an inspiring story and one that you're going to want to hear. And then 2 weeks following that, again, we're going to hear from the new director of the Ann Arbor District Library. Thank you all. This was terrific. And I just enjoyed it immensely. So good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.